Hey, fiends of the pod, this is your host, Nate Wyckoff, and I want to remind you, go ahead and like and subscribe and check out cultandclassicfilms.com, where you can get cult movies exclusive to us with all sorts of extras like pogs. We're supposed to call them milk caps. They're not pogs. I don't know what pogs are. Autographed posters, slipcovers, all sorts of neat things. You can also subscribe to have them delivered to your door every month at a discount. That is cultandclassicfilms.com. Remember, like, subscribe, comment, and refer to your friends, even your enemies. Every time you like and subscribe, we make sure Michael Cera makes another film. Yeah, that's right. It's us. Enjoy.
Welcome to Cult and Classic.
Welcome, friends and fiends, to another episode of Cult and Classic Podcast, a podcast where we discuss two thematically linked films, a more mainstream film and a more cult film, and we talk about them both. I am your host, Nate Wyckoff, comedian and film critic for horrornews.net, as well as other places, and I'm really excited to dive into today's theme choices, which are Strange Magic, aka the lesser known films about Doctor Strange, the famous but second level tier Marvel comic book character. In 2016, of course, Benedict Cumberbatch became Dr. Stephen Strange in the shared Marvel universe to fairly high acclaim. I personally enjoyed that movie a lot. And this is a great 70s Marvel character when they weren't afraid to get a little weird. Lots of crossovers with Steve Gerber's comics like Man Thing and of course the amazing Howard the Duck. That is not a joke. If you don't know, read the Howard the Duck comics. They're epic. But there are two films that were done before the 2016 Benedict Cumberbatch Doctor Strange movie. First up is the Doctor Strange TV film from 1978. And then there is the 1990, I believe it's 1992 film, Dr. Mordrid, which is a Doctor Strange film, sort of. And we'll talk about what that means when we get there. But we're going to start with 1978's Doctor Strange. Before we dive into the film itself and all the interesting things surrounding this, I'm going to introduce you to your panelists this week. We have with us Jeffrey Tucker. How are you doing, Jeff?
Just like the 1978 Doctor Strange, my superpower is being ultra sexy.
It's true. And those of you who are interested, we do have our episodes loading at a later date than airing on the podcast, but they load in video form on YouTube as well in the Cult and Classic podcast channel. So check that out. And we also have the wonderful Amanda Longley. How are you doing, Mandy?
I am hanging in there today.
Hanging in there, hanging in there. We, of course, for anyone who's like, how come Nate's so chipper? How come other people sound less energetic? It's because we're on different coasts. So depending on when we record this podcast, half of us are awake and half of us are delirious. So yeah.
I thought it was the cocaine.
Okay. So the next and final panelist to round out our cast is Tad Mastroianni. How are you doing, Tad?
I don't need a PhD to do this podcast.
Doctor. Yeah, only one of them actually seems to have I guess they both have a PhD, but neither of them really come into play. Yeah, so I'm excited about this. Those who listen to the podcast often will know that I'm a comic book fan, as are all of us. And Doctor Strange is one of my favorite characters because I really like the occult area. I mean, many of the films we talk about on Cult and Classic Podcast have some sort of occult vibe. In fact, cult is in the name of the podcast. Yeah, but it's a strange property for Marvel because Marvel tends to have more popular science-y properties like Iron Man, Spider-Man. You know, it was the product of science gone awry. The Hulk, the product of science gone awry. All of these things, they science-based, so they get a little weird or strange, if you will, when they move into the magic territory. And Doctor Strange is a really cool character. There's been a few different origins that they've messed with in the Marvel universes, but the one that is standard, and I believe the original as well, is that Dr. Stephen Strange is a master surgeon, and his hands become damaged to the point where he's essentially crippled with his hands, and he can no longer operate. So he goes to, I think, the Himalayas to seek out someone referred to as the Ancient One, a mystic who supposedly has the power to heal him. Well, yes and no. He ends up doing sort of a Batman, but instead of becoming a vigilante, he becomes a mystic protector of this plane of existence. And he learns that his need for notoriety and physical success is unnecessary because he is there are multiple planes, and the things he thought were important are not important, and the things that he didn't even think about are actually what's important. So it's kind of a self-revelation series, as well as a mystic arts series. He is known also as the Sorcerer Supreme. And in 1978, this is kind of at the start, middle-ish of like Marvel's dig into TV fame and fandom. Of course, there was the early Spider-Man live-action TV show, which I used to watch all the time, reruns as a kid, where we had Spider-Man climbing up walls, which were actually floors that he would climb on, and then they just turned the film sideways, which is actually really genius. That film mostly had Spider-Man getting his butt kicked over and over again by common thugs. But it's fun time. There's several TV movies edited out of individual episodes that you can find online on VHS and DVD and so forth of that. But also, of course, the very successful, very well-known the Hulk series with strongman Lou Ferrigno as the physical Hulk. There was a long-running series that was very successful. It brought the Hulk to the masses, and also it's resulted in, I think, 2 TV movies thereafter, ending with the death of the Hulk. And I think, was it 90? I mean, it was 86, somewhere in there. You can IMDb that. You don't need me for that. But during this, Marvel started to bring in other properties to this universe, trying to experiment and branch out. They were never quite as successful as the Hulk, but in, I think, the first Hulk TV movie, they brought in Thor, God of Thunder, who is in the current iterations of Marvel films played by Chris Hemsworth, who is massive and a great cast. And then he also brought in Captain America. And Captain America actually had 2 films during this run, Captain America and Captain America 2, Death Too Soon. I'm not going to spoil anything on those, except to say that he wears a motorcycle helmet that's sort of Captain America-ish. But we will actually be covering these films in a future Cult and Classic podcast. So I won't spoil those, but they are available. And they're actually available from Shout Factory on DVD as a 2-pack. So you can check those out on your own if you like, or you can wait until we talk about it and decide yourself. The other property that they tried to launch was a TV series based on Doctor Strange called Doctor Strange. That is Dr. Strange. If you're watching a video of this, the interesting poster I found from overseas for this film says Doctor all spelled out. That's not technically correct. It was promoted, written, and copyrighted and all that jazz as Dr. Strange, Doctor Strange. So this is the 1978 pilot, which those familiar with pilots, especially from the 70s through the 90s, it was essentially a movie. And they were like, we will show this. And if people are interested and we can garner enough support, then it will be a series continuing on after that. A lot of times now, a pilot is just a small, short episode with probably not finalized casting, that's sort of a proof of concept. But this was, like many of the time, really a full movie. It did not result in a series. I have some theories as to why. And believe it or not, my personal theory is not that it's terrible, but there are some problems, deserved and undeserved. Now, this film is directed by Philippe de Guerre Jr. as Philippe de Guerre, and Philip wrote for lots of TV shows. Most recently, wrote for JAG up until his death in 2005. But he also wrote a couple of episodes and directed them for The Twilight Zone in the 80s, which I'm sure came off of the heels of doing this pilot. He also wrote for Simon and Simon, Air America, 18 Wheels of Justice, the Dead Zone TV series in the 2000s. So really kind of all over the place, but definitely experienced in the TV world. Never really branched into the full-fledged silver screen. It starred Peter Houghton as Doctor Strange himself. I always think of him as Paul from the horror movie Orca, the killer whale, but he also was Tony in the original Inglourious Basterds film, not to be confused with the Quentin Tarantino homage. And the villain of this, excuse me, not the villain, Wong, who fans of the comics and fans of the 2016 movie will recognize as sort of the Asian assistant to the Ancient One, who is the teacher of Doctor Strange, is played in this by Clyde Kusatsu. And Clyde, very recognizable. He's still acting all the way up to today. He's got upcoming series work going out. He was in geez, he was in Dr. Ken, the short-lived sitcom. He does voice work. He was in Major Lazer, all sorts of stuff. And then we have Anne-Marie Martin, who plays Clea Lake, which is the love interest in the comics of Doctor Strange. She's really interesting. She was one of the leads in Prom Night, the 80s horror flick that's much loved by cult fans. But also she's a writer, and she actually wrote the script for Twister. So fascinating links here. And then we get to my favorite cast member, Jessica Walter. She's an incredibly competent and established actress who's still working today. And I am deeply in love with her for voicing Mallory Archer in the animated TV show Archer, starring H. John Benjamin on FX. She's great. She's absolutely great. And she's beautiful in this. She gets to play Morgan or Morgana, the evil sorceress, who is the sort of antithesis of Doctor Strange. I've babbled a lot. Let's just say that the plot of this follows Doctor Strange being contacted by the original or the previous Sorcerer Supreme, taught the magic arts sort of against his will, being tempted by Morgana, and then turning away from her in order to save his predecessor and his sort of love icon, Clea Lake. There's a lot of weird moments in this movie, and there's some dull stretches, I feel. So we're going to dive right in here before we get into the ins and outs of what worked and what didn't and why maybe it wasn't picked up. We're going to start with Tad, because I know Tad is a Doctor Strange fan, and I'm sure he has a huge amount to say.
Okay, let me pull out my notes here, Nate, because I had a few. This is
just a couple of nuggets.
Sure, this is the whitest blaxploitation film I've ever seen. That's one.
Okay.
Two, it's a porno that never gets past the 5 minutes of plot buildup.
Fair. We'll talk. So let's talk about that first. Let's do this quick breakdown. So I'm assuming with blaxploitation, you're talking about the fashions, but also the music.
Yes, especially the music.
I'm going to say this. We're going to talk about music in the second version. We're going to talk Dr. Mordred as well. The music in this is, I think, friggin' phenomenal. It goes from like sort of a psychedelic 70s stoner rock to like this really discordant sort of goblin-esque soundtrack from Suspiria inspired film music, especially in the beginning. I thought it was way head and shoulders above a lot of the stuff that we heard in, say, The Hulk, which is an iconic soundtrack, but I wouldn't say it's ageless by any stretch. But I actually would put a lot of this in my movie now. But let's keep going. What else?
It's not exactly the soundtrack from the $6 Million Man. I can tell you that much.
That is true.
I would say like the soundtrack almost overpowered some of the scenes. I'd say that would be the one downside to it. It was very good, and the music was exceptional, but it almost was a little too extra for some of the. It was just like a scene of a person walking like across a yard, and then like
kind
up
of a lot
escalator
of
or something.
Of like just banal things in the middle of this film,
and then you have this really intense it's just such extra music over it. It's like, okay, this music is way overpowering this scene. I'm enjoying it, but it's like it's very noticeable. Anybody could watch it without.
Yeah, that's actually part of what I was thinking when I was watching the movie. Is there are so many high pitched sounds that just drone into your head while you're trying to watch this movie. Like I watched the Orson Welles War of the Worlds colorized movie when I was a kid. And that sound always sticks in my head. That sound when the aliens are hovering around and it's all through this movie. They just recycled it. And I mean, it's iconic. It's an iconic sound, but it doesn't belong in this movie. It's like every time Morgana shows up, or Morgan, I always call her Morgana. But when Morgan shows up, you hear this sound and I'm just like, oh, the aliens are about to melt me. When so my third note was, this is like a really crappy Doctor Who episode. Like some of the special effects, some of the sounds.
That's quite damning, I would say, because Doctor Who has some obscenely crappy episodes.
Some of the earliest episodes are just trash. I'm
an old school lover, so I can say that fairly. But yeah, so let's there's a lot there to unpack. Let's move along. Mandy, what was your feel when you watched this film?
I was really hoping for more pleat-fronted pants, which I was rewarded with in the next film.
You were
Yeah.
It moved on, and it took over. The 80s really hit hard in Dr. Mordrid. We'll talk about that.
Yeah.
Even though it was made in the 90s.
And I don't know. I guess to steal a line from, was it 10 Things I Hate About You, like can you just be whelmed? Because I didn't feel like overwhelmed or really underwhelmed by like either of these. They were just very like, I guess, like TV movies, and not really characters that I'm super familiar with. So I was just like, yeah, okay, like this is some interesting kind of weird storylines. I could follow it. Yeah, but like ultimately, meh. Kinda.
Fair. Jeff,
Yeah.
what was your expectation, and then what was your take on it? Because I know that you actually expected it, especially if you look at screenshots with the super 70s like shaggy hair and big mustaches. You were expecting, I think, worse than you probably got.
Yeah, so I think it's a bit forgotten. And so things like that are really popular content, that they have something that's forgotten, like a Star Wars special, or tend to be on the bad side. Like people don't forget that stuff unless there's a reason. But I actually thought it was better than that. I thought this was actually could be somewhat memorable. My problem with this film is they really went down like a romance, like seduction route.
Yeah.
Even further than like the occult, which was weird, and it I don't know, it came off strange a couple of times. Like I joked at the beginning, like my superpower is I'm super sexy, but that honestly was like for the first half of the film. Doctor Strange's superpower. He defeats Morgan Le Fay because he's super sexy and she doesn't want to kill him. It's just like, I don't know.
He said, you know, it was like a pornography film from the 70s that never got started, or that never continued on. And it's interesting because I'm going to hazard my guess as to why this didn't get picked up, is that actually it pushed a couple of envelopes a little bit too far for primetime TV at this time. Because the Hulk, you got the sort of the same thing as like, you got the same level of like love, quote unquote, or romance as you got in the Fugitive TV show, right? Like, you know that they loved this person, and that's enough to cause tension. But in Doctor Strange, they insinuate that he's a bit of a ladies' man in the beginning. He's got lipstick on his collar, and he's, you know, always telling the nurse that he's going to call her, which he never ever does in the movie. And then, you know, Morgana is like, she's been imprisoned in another plane for several hundred years, and she doesn't kill Dr. Stephen Strange when she gets the chance, because she's physically attracted to him and has to have love, which is redonkulous. You know, I mean, I'm going to stop short of saying it's sexist, but I am going to say that it's, without additional information, it's questionable. But there's also like Clea Lake's character, or the character Clea Lake, is very aggressive. Anne-Marie Martin's character, she's pretty aggressive with Stephen Strange for a comic book TV show, in that, like, when she basically is possessed by Morgana and pushes the original Sorcerer Supreme, or the previous one, over an overpass. He survives, but she thinks she's killed him. And because she's been touched by evil, essentially, she's destined to die, we assume, in her sleep of some kind. Her spirit is pulled to another plane, and Stephen Strange, who treats her at the hospital, is contacted by the original Sorcerer Supreme and says, hey, you've got a talent, you have to be the next protector, but it has to be your choice. And he ultimately does it to save both Clea Lake and this old man sorcerer before him. But like, she recovers initially, and is like, you want to go out? Like, she's pretty forward about it. She's like, we should hang out. And he's like, well, a doctor and patient. I'm not a patient anymore. Come on over. And then when he comes over, she kisses him. And then they start to roll around on her bed. And then she's essentially attacked again. And Morgana shows up and tries to do a sort of temptation of Christ, and offer Doctor Strange all sorts of riches, which he's pretty open to accepting, until he sees the old man dying in the other plane, and decides to push back. So it's interesting because I did not expect that in this film. And I don't know if it's maybe that they thought maybe they thought in the TV movie, in the pilot, they could push it a little farther than they ultimately would in the series. But I have a feeling that it was kind of an intentional choice to say, let's see if we can get a little more with this, because the Hulk series really was like a human interest story, right? Like he really just blew into every town, uncovered some crime going on, and solved it and made some normal blue collar person like their life a little better, and then blew to the next town. You got some interesting human interest stories, but otherwise it was like the A-Team, right? Like he shows up, fixes something, and then leaves. And Doctor Strange, that's not the way they've set this up. And the second point that I'd like to touch on to say is that the occult elements in this were, I think, probably a little unsettling for a good chunk of the audience for prime time, especially that time, very Bible Belt, middle class. Like it opens with Morgana in what looks like some hell realm talking to a big puppet sculpture that's mostly obscured by smoke and has 4 glowing eyes and has like a beak. They've never speak on what he is, but we can assume from the Marvel comics that he's Dormammu or Dormu, however you would say that name, which is in the 2016 film as well. And there's lots of occult imagery throughout. Most of it's made up, but that with the quote that they open with, which is very much, there are other planes of existence, there's good and evil, and there's a constant battle, and some people in our plane are pulled in. It felt what I would call unwholesome to someone who is actually scared of a real life devil, which I think is still a prominent part of the TV viewership. I mean, we have seen previous elections and how zealotous religious things can get, but I think that was a lot more than they were expecting. I can't think of another show that openly had things that close to Satanism and demonology and things like that hit prime time. I mean, later on, you got things like Kolchak and Night Stalker, things like that push closer, and then the 90s, Kindred, and things like that really kind of overwhelmed the envelope. But at this point in time, I just can't see it. And I think that it was sort of dead on arrival, because I really don't think that you would have gotten a lot of buy-in. I think TV stations were probably scared to push it that far. And that's why I think we ended up getting this whole middle segment that's like a hospital romance. There's so many scenes in the middle of a hospital with him just wandering back and forth, not doing much hospitalness. I don't, what is your take on that, Tad? Because that was where it fell apart for me before it came back at the end for me. I was hooked in the beginning and I was hooked at the end, but the middle, I was sort of like, how are we progressing? It felt like they were going back and forth between just Clea's in a coma in the hospital, and Doctor Strange is like, well, I've seen you do magic, sorcerer, but I don't want to be a magician.
This is a classic movie that shows just like how pacing matters, because the first 30 minutes felt like an hour. Like I thought 30 minutes into this movie, I literally was like, oh, this must be at the hour mark. And I'm like, 33 goddamn minutes? Are you fucking kidding me? There's still an hour of this movie left. And then it turns out that he doesn't actually do anything Doctor Strange like until an hour in. There's a half an hour in the movie left by the time he actually like gets powers, and I'm pretty sure there's 5 minutes in the fucking movie left by the time he gets his costume. I'm like, are you fucking kidding me? And by the way, I did some research, and it turns out I believe that the villain is actually the Nameless One. And I'm like, of all the things they picked the fucking Nameless One.
Fair.
Never mind. He sounds like Bane from The Dark Knight Rises. Like, no joke. Like, the voice is like, this is the instrument of your liberation. This is the way he talks. And he talks like Tom Hardy. I'm like, what the fuck is going on here?
That's an interesting thing to point his voice, because he does have sort of a weird, roughly British, roughly Eastern European voice. He's uncredited. It's the actor's David Cassidy. Excuse me, not David Cassidy, not Ted Cassidy either. David Hooks. David Hooks is the voice of the Nameless One. And I'm sure that they chose that intentionally, because they also had the voice at one brief part of the actual Ancient One, not the human vessel, which is what we see him saving the old man. So I assumed that they wanted some sort of parallel. And David Hook's also, he's very longtime TV actor. He was in Time Trackers. He was in Remington Steele in an episode. Lots of here or there. He was several episodes of the original V miniseries, which is seeing a bit of a resurgence here. But we sort of get more of him than of any of Doctor Strange's actual, I don't know if you call it backstory, but sort of, as you said, the magic part. We got a lot of the evil side of the magic part, which I think is engaging, but not very much of what Doctor Strange does. And also, perhaps because of the limitations of what time they had left after working so much romance angle with Clea Lake, they totally skip over his learning any actual magic. He has his medallion, but he's only told, like, when he goes to the higher plane for the first time to save Clea from her like coma, he's given a chance to drive demons away. He uses it once, shoves a demon away, and then later on he tries it again and it doesn't work, and he just has a power from his ring, which is, I guess, his amulet at that point, and no actual magic. Whereas the Sorcerer Supreme, before him is sort of, he's a Jedi basically, which makes sense. Like that's kind of what Tilda Swinton's Ancient One was in the 2016 Benedict Cumberbatch, right? Like, wave a hand and someone is like, yeah, let me in. Oh, okay, I'll let you in. That sort of thing. I guess I saw one review online for this that I thought was pretty accurate, and what they titled it was the greatest superhero TV show we never got. And I think it's accurate, not because this pilot was completely stellar, but because what it started to promise by the end was actually super interesting, because there's a couple of elements it looked like they were leaning towards. One, he's a ladies' man, right? Stephen Strange is a ladies' man, but he's clearly got a relationship with this Clea Lake character by the end, who in many of the comic iterations becomes his disciple. And also sometimes they have a kid, depending on which universe you're looking at. That sort of leads to a tag team, like the Thin Man sort of husband-wife team element that could be interesting. And then you also have the fact that his mentor, the previous Sorcerer Supreme, is still alive at the end, giving it a kung fu element, right? Like you're expecting that he will be trained as the series goes on. Then Morgana she fails, right? He rejects her, and the Nameless One says, "You're going to be punished by being old until you beg me to stop, and I'll still keep you." Whatever. Clearly not, because at the end of the movie, Clea, who doesn't really remember much, and he are setting up a date again, another first date, and they pass a TV, and there's Morgan, who is essentially leading a cult under the guise of self-empowerment for young people, which is super interesting, especially in the 70s, right? And that's a really cool setup for how they could do what would certainly have to be done, limiting the special effects component while having a lot of intrigue in the real mortal world. So they had really good ideas. And I think that it had super strong promise to be much more interesting and much more complex than the other Marvel properties that had been on TV and were currently on TV. So I think that the promise was there, and I think that the cast was very strong, although, again, they were given this whole center plot that was just cliche and unnecessary. Because we got some cool moments, right? Like I thought, like when Morgan goes to before Strange is officially inducted as the Sorcerer Supreme, his to-be mentor goes to his door and puts a charm there. And you don't know what's happened. Morgana shows up later, sees a cat, controls the cat, and sends the cat to the door, at which point, like, electricity sparks and the cat runs away and she turns around. It's clearly been charmed. Like, they have these little bits that are very sort of Dennis Wheatley 70s horror novel, like occult gothic-y vibes, which I think is really appropriate for Doctor Strange. But it just gives way to, I mean, it's a little over an hour and a half, and it feels like probably 50 to an hour is really just sort of dull talking head hospital play. And I think Tom Houghton as Doctor Strange, I actually found him quite charismatic. Like, he's a good looking guy. His hair is bad, but it's the 70s. His mustache was actually appropriate for once. And
Dr. Dirk Diggler.
It's very much that. But I thought that there was a lot of promise. Again, I have a hard time imagining that the problematic dull middle is what killed this. I think these projects tend to die before they air, if they die. And I think that's what happened with this one. I think they looked at it and said, interesting. Well, Duguier, you may be able to direct a couple episodes of, I don't know, The Twilight Zone, if they ever do another series, wink, wink. But this is too much for the mainstream.
And
I
want to add in here. So I think that if you're making like a pilot, like there's like a couple things you're trying to do, right? You're like trying to set up your show. You're trying to, basically show what the show is. Like, if it's a, it's a procedural crime show, you show your, the structure or whatever that you're building in. Obviously it has to be entertaining. I think that this got caught up in trying to, like, in its own origin almost. It got like it like you said, like, we don't know what the show is going to be. Is it going to be like a doctor show, like a doctor drama in this hospital that we spend half the film in? Is it going to be a superhero film where like the hospital is just like a way for him to meet like crazy people that have like run into it's just like, what is the show? I don't know what the show is. I imagine it could be pretty interesting, but who knows? Like if you actually look at the structure of the film, it really is just, it's so weird because it's just origin. Like it's such an awkward thing. Like usually, like if you watch a superhero film, the origin is like this part of the film. It's like, Spider-Man gets bit by a spider and then we move on. There's some sort of drama that's related to it. In this one, it was like the drama was like part of the origin story,
right? And
the origin story was the whole thing. And the ending, essentially the end climax is him becoming Doctor Strange. And so from that point, it almost has a hard time being entertaining because it just doesn't have that flow and climax. And because like at the end of the movie, I'm like, is this the end? Like, is there more? Like, is there going to be another thing that's going to happen? I'm just like, like, and where's my ending? It just didn't. It like kind of happened.
We'll talk about this.
20 minutes from the end, and then there was just it was
more
weird.
Shit. It's like I thought the movie ended, and I walked out of the room because I fully expected the credits to roll, and then I come back downstairs. I'm like, they're still talking. What the fuck is going on?
Yeah. It was so weird. I feel like if they had just maybe done, and I'm not going to say that this was a good example of it, but so Firefly shot a pilot. And then they didn't air that first. They're like, no, we're not. You're doing too much origin. Maybe we're just going to just give us one of your episodes. We're going to air that first. And then we'll put the pilot in later. And I think that I'm not saying I agree with this move, but it was like, here's what the show is. This is an entertaining episode. If you're into it, come back for the origin story in the second episode. And I think maybe this would have done better with that. Just from, or maybe just have it be rewritten so that the first episode or the pilot was just more interesting and just wasn't bogged down by this.
Well, and I know Ted hates this. Oh, sorry, Manny.
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, I think that it's just like in general, like storytelling. There are some stories that are really good to tell, like from the beginning straight through, step by step, and then there are other stories like are much better in the telling where you like see part of the end first, and then like you go back. And like you fill it in once people really care about it and are hooked.
Yeah.
This one took a long time to tell us not very much. And honestly, like, we're probably not going to see a lot of the elements that are covered in this film, like in the TV show. like in the actual episodes. Like maybe, I mean, I would imagine that there's something going on with Morgana, like, but
I think that you're both right on the spot. I think what you're hinting at is that we get tired of origins in this day and age because they've been rebooted so many times. We've seen them over and over again. So we're starting to see films that don't really give you an origin, or they give you just the opening scene is essentially the origin. Like Guardians of the Galaxy, only Peter Quill has an origin, and it's one scene. We get more as the series progresses, but that's it. You know, you get little bits and pieces, and that's all you really need because there's a plot ahead that they're going to tackle. And I respect what I think they were trying to do with this film, which was instead of making the origin exposition, which is essentially what origins tend to be, you know, relegated to, is look at all the shit you have to know in order to get this. And we get tired and we hate it. Or we already know it, like fans of the comics who were going to sit down to watch this already knew Doctor Strange, right? So instead they said, well, let's try and make the origin the story. Which is kind of what you guys were getting at, right? The problem is that they took out the conflict from the origin. And Tad's giving he's got a great life. He's a successful doctor. He's super handsome. He's super suave. And normally it would be, he has to overcome some great difficulty, like having your hands crippled, right? That ends your career. And having an entire, collapse of your fragile self schema. Like these things have to happen in order for there to be some sort of change to the character. By the end of this, we really didn't see Dr. Stephen Strange as the Sorcerer Supreme yet because he hadn't been trained and he really didn't overcome anything.
He wasn't struggling
right.
at all.
Like, I mean, I understand why he was like, nope, I don't want anything to do with this. I saved my patient and I'm done. Why would he? I mean, really, like there was no drive, there was no selflessness. Like he acts selflessly. And I liked the things I did like in this is that in the in lots of the origin interpretations of Doctor Strange, including the 2016 Marvel Cinematic Universe entry, he's a jerk in the beginning. He's really self-absorbed, and that's part of the transition for him, right? Into something that's a protector, the greater good, regardless of the small circumstance. And in this, the first thing we get of Doctor Strange is him walking to the hospital being a ladies' man, but then we get him sitting down with an alcoholic woman who's in her 50s to 60s who has ulcers, and she's begging him to give her something to sleep. And he's like, you have to lay off the booze because the ulcers are going to keep you up. And later we see what we suspect, which is this is a woman who's a repeat, visitor and is chronic condition. That's something they aren't really equipped to help. And they're like, why are you bothering with her? And what he does is says, look, you can stay here tonight and we'll give you something to sleep because you won't be able to get alcohol and you'll be able to sleep. And they're like, that's a bed that is being used. And he's like, no, this is a person. Right. And that was a neat moment. And I appreciate that they did that because I think they understood that it was necessary to give him this sort of kind giving part, because otherwise his decision to become the sorcerer wouldn't make any sense because he didn't have that hurdle anymore of having the broken hands and not knowing who he was, from an identity ego self perspective. So I liked that, but I think, and who knows if producers got involved and were like, hey, you can't do all this weird magic shit. Because there's like a demon, Balthazar, it's a Balsmodius, I think. They just Asmodeus, they just add B in front of it, I think. But he's like a demon knight on a horse. Like he's in there. There's spooky set pieces. It must have cost a little more than the average Hulk episode, except for there were no explosions in it. So maybe not. It's hard to tell, but I feel like they were probably leaning in saying, hey, you can't do all of this shit all the time. You have to have, so they probably were like, okay, well, we'll put the hospital in because that's going to be, it's interesting. It's a hospital. This will be a strong main space for him. Problem is it's not interesting. And it seemed like an afterthought that crammed in to turn it into an hour and a half instead of an hour-long episode. So there's
it
that
also
problem.
it was not period accurate because I didn't see one person light up in that hospital throughout the entire
That's
movie.
true. Of course, to be fair, you often wouldn't see that on prime time. It was one of those dirty little secrets that everybody lived. I mean, we saw it, It's Alive, the original version. Like, they're fucking smoking up in that hospital right next to the nursery. Like, he's smoking a cigarette while he's looking at babies. Yeah. So I guess what I'd like to say is that I actually found this much more interesting than I expected. I think, like Jeff, expected it to really be a heaping pile of 70s trash. And I love 70s trash, but 70s TV trash that's meant as a pilot and not a standalone has a special place in being dull, typically. And while this has dull moments, I did enjoy the idea of seeing a nameless, essentially devil figure in smoke open up this family time slot evening show, like drama show. I thought that was impressive. I thought that Jessica Walters' figure was quite beautiful. She opens in this sexy red Morgana cleavage dress, and it was much more engaging right off the bat than I thought. And in the end, we get some more of that. There's a really, I mean, when the mentor figure he's essentially put in a coma and his spirit is taken to the higher plane so he can be killed unprotected. Morgana has him. She shows Strange, his mentor, like strung between these ugly trees, and he's painted very ghoulishly. Like, he looks like a corpse, straight out of or one of the demonic dead spirits from Carnival of Souls. And it was, I thought that was a little dark for this kind of show, and I don't think that helped. I think that this is the moment where kids that would have stayed up late, being like, oh, the Hulk, and they're like, okay, huh, well, you can watch it, and then they'd be like, honey, go to bed, this is gruesome. I thought that would have been a little much. Of course, it's super tame today, but we didn't have NCIS back then at the time. And of course, I've mentioned him several times. Lindmere is the Sorcerer Supreme who is presumably going to change Doctor Strange, Lindmere, and he's played by John Mills, who died in 2005 and was a super prolific 40s and 50s actor. Especially, he acted all the way up until his death, but he was in the 46 Great Expectations, Hobson's Choice in 1954, very successful. He was also in a production of Cats in 98, which was not the most recent one, but if anyone has seen that, he played the role of Gus, the theater cat, which was Ian McKellen in the new very strange rendition of a very strange musical. So that, I think, does it for the 1978 TV film, aka pilot, Doctor Strange from the Marvel property. Let's go around the horn and talk about, would we recommend it, and if so, to who and why. Jeff, would you recommend this film to someone, and why?
It actually does have some good parts. Like the acting's pretty good. It definitely has some talent in there. The music, is a little overpowering, but it is quite good. And I wouldn't necessarily still recommend. I mean, if you're like interested to go back and watch a little thing that could have been something, and then have lots of dreams and imaginations, I think it's maybe worth watching. If it were me, I'd go back and I'd remake this, get rid of all the romance. I love Sam and Diane, but it doesn't belong in the first episode. I think the most interesting thing in this film is this kind of like battle of wits between Morgan Le Fay and the Sorcerer Supreme. And Doctor Strange in this film is almost just like a pawn. He's just like a mouse that these two are kind of toying with. I want to just dive so hard into that and basically end this pilot with him becoming the Sorcerer Supreme, and then he's going to go through learning and, I don't know, some sort of hijinks in the show. I think that would have been more interesting.
I like that. I like the idea of actually, it could have actually made sense of the hero rejecting his chosen status, moment that happens in the hero's journey. Like, it could have made sense of that, and actually could have made it a plot point. Like in the comics,
yeah, stop toying with me. Right, I'm a man. Leave me alone.
It's like, for the higher good, you're still sacrificing this man's normal life, right? It would have been very interesting. I think that there's lots of elements that could still be taken from that had they done a series, but I agree with you. And I liked the chemistry between. I thought the Clea Lake character was well done, but it just it was
put that in the series. Like save that for later. Like there's just not enough space for it, and it's just not interesting enough to hold a
Agreed.
Basically a pilot. Yeah.
Good comment. Mandy, would you recommend the 1978 Doctor Strange film to anyone? And if so, why? And if not, why not?
I don't think that I would ask anyone to spend an hour and a half of their time on this, as you did.
Gotcha.
Yeah, no. It's just kind of like we've already just discussed at length. It's kind of like a big yawn. It poses a couple interesting questions of like what the show would have been like, but obviously that didn't happen. Yeah, I don't know. Like it's just kind of like I said coming into this, like meh.
Fair. Tad, would you recommend this film to someone, and why or why not?
Not recommended, because we have something better now. As a matter of fact, I could tell that the creative team behind the 2016 film definitely kept this old pilot in mind when they were creating the new movie, because I stopped, like, as soon as the Doctor Who tunnel started in this one, I paused it, went over to Disney Plus and watched the transition and everything from the multiverse scene from the 2016 movie and went, oh, that's right, I remember how much I love this movie, and then went back to this normal movie. But we can just watch the new Doctor Strange movie, and then the new one that's coming out, I don't know, next year now. I don't know when.
I think it's been bumped again. Yeah, I think that's fair. I think the average moviegoer definitely is going to find the Benedict Cumberbatch one more interesting. I know that there's some people who didn't like it. I actually found it the most refreshing of many of the recent Marvel properties. I mean, I think they're all enjoyable to a certain extent, but that one actually was a strong standalone film about an interesting character. And of course, you had incredible acting talent on it as well. There were complaints, understandably, about Tilda Swinton playing a character called the Ancient One that seemed, by context, to have been better cast as an Asian person. I will say, in the comics, it's never appeared that the Ancient One was an Asian person. That's not. Yeah, we're seeing the Doctor Strange animated film DVD that Jeff is showing the screen. And that's an interesting one. That one is very close to the film, the 2016
film. And this came out in 2007. So yeah. I was just going to say that we had a better version in 2007.
It's true. It's true. And that one's very interesting too, because I think we have a lot to talk about with the Dr. Mordrid film up next. But I think we can just take pride in the fact that while they didn't cast an Asian person as the leader of the mystic arts, at least they cast a woman. And that is a bonus, because otherwise this story is full of strong male men that sort of overpower women. It's just an odd dynamic that we see time and time again. And in the 2016 film, that was sort of subverted. So good for them. Also, Tilda Swinton plays a very androgynous character in that. She happens to be a biological woman, but it's never made to be as though she is a woman one way or the other.
That's kind of her shtick. Remember Constantine?
Sure. I mean, Tilda Swinton loves to straddle that line, and she's a great actress. I mean, I agree with you. I think her performance as an angel in Constantine was the pinnacle nerd moment for me with Tilda Swinton. She's great. But anyway, we're going to get to me. I'm going to just round it up with this. This film is a little dull, but if you are a fan of the comics, of any comics, and you like finding these, what was often only available via bootlegs, we actually watched a bootleg that I picked up years before it was released on DVD, remastered by Shout Factory, which is a much better transfer. The one we had is not terrible, but the Shout Factory transfer, which is still available, is much better. Pick it up, see what the fuss is about, especially if you like the 70s 80s Hulk show, or the early or late 60s, is it late 60s Spider-Man show, I believe. Watch it, check it out. It's worth your time, because it's in that same vein, but it's very different, and it would have been cool to see another series pick up with a different spin, a different focus, and sort of, I think, a different age level. So there we go. That's it for this section, but we're going to take a quick break, and then we're going to come back and talk about 1992's Dr. Mordrid.
Hey, Cult and Classic crew, friends and fiends of the pod, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, Nate, I don't have any money, and if I did, I'd be spending it on cool things like buttons and custom trading cards and zines that are unique and made each week by the Cult and Classic podcast family. And guess what? You can do both of those things at once. You can support cultandclassicpodcast.com and get awesome swag like buttons and custom trading cards that are printed on actual trading card stock by actual trading card printers and autographed by the artist, and also zines like classic issues of Rearted with comics and illustrations and interviews, as well as brand new Cult and Classic podcast family publications that are brand new, so you'll get them first in line. These are awesome, awesome things that you can get just by joining our Patreon at patreon.com/Cult and Classic Podcast. For as little as $1 a month, you can get videos of our episodes, so you can see all our lovely shining faces, as well as exclusive content like extra episodes, film reviews, book reviews, and things like commentary by us on our short films, which you'll also be able to see. If you want to pay a little more, $5 a month per se, US, then you get an awesome autographed custom trading card. These are official, printed at the same place that prints every other trading card you've ever bought, and they're autographed by the artist. These are exclusively for Cult and Classic Podcast and inspired by our episodes. You can't get them anywhere else except through us. Only $5 a month, you get it shipped right to you. Shipping is free. If you pay $10 a month, if you are a true drinker of the Kool-Aid for cultandclassicpodcast.com, then you will get the trading card, access to all of the content that is exclusive to Patreon members, and you will get a brand new zine every month, whether it's a classic copy of Rearted zine with interviews, comics, art, all sorts of cool stuff, or brand new Cult and Classic Podcast family publications. Those will get sent straight to your door. Plus, there's usually extras like pins, stickers, all sorts of cool stuff. So you're doing two great things. You are spending money on awesome swag, and you are supporting Cult and Classic Podcast. I know it's tough right now in the pandemic. If you can do it, join us at Cult and Classic Podcast Patreon. If you can't, why don't you recommend it to a friend? We all have those rich friends, and they can spread it around a little more. I'm just going to say it. All right? Thank you so much. And as always, Cult and Classic Podcast loves you.
And we are back. Okay, fans, we are going to tackle Dr. Mordrid from 1992. This is a Full Moon production by Albert and Charles Band. Charles Band, of course, head of Full Moon, and Albert Band is his father, who produced, wrote, and directed some films before this, back into, I think, the 70s. Very interesting record. There's a lot to talk about before we even get to the actual movie with this. Because first off, as we all know, we here at Cult and Classic Podcast are big fans of Full Moon Pictures, Full Moon Features, Full Moon Productions, Full Moon Direct, Full Moon Streaming, all of those things which are Full Moon Video. And we've done some great ones. My personal favorite, Head of the Family. We also, we've done so many. Terror Vision, Bad Channels. We've done a lot, and we will do a lot more because they've done some fantastic stuff. This is a very interesting film because, of course, it looks straight up like a Doctor Strange ripoff. There's a very good reason for this. This actually began production as Doctor Strange, but mid-production, probably early production actually, or pre-production, they lost the license. Now, why did they lose the license? Why did they have the license in the first place? Lots of questions. Marvel was going through lots of trouble in the mid to late 90s. In fact, in 1996, some of you may not remember, especially young listeners may not remember, Marvel filed for bankruptcy in 1996. I believe they filed several times in ensuing years for various types of debt relief in addition to this. But they filed because they were losing money, because the comic market sort of crashed. It was full of special edition covers, 11 different covers of one issue. Image Comics had begun with Spawn and Savage Dragon and Youngblood, and essentially a huge chunk of their best talent, Eric Larson, Jim Lee, of course, Todd McFarlane, at the time Rob Liefeld, had left Marvel because of Marvel's draconian licensing issues, where if you created anything on their time, you lost all ownership of it. So you had to physically quit in order to do anything of your own. So they did. They got together and they said, we're going to start Image Comics, which is still here. Image Comics really dove in hard to the multiple covers thing and the special editions and launching a million titles because of their success, which contributed further to the collapsing of the market when people realized that these issues were not really collectible at the time because so many were being printed. There was no scarcity. It was both a dark time and an amazing time. The dark time in that Marvel was grasping at straws and licensing out everything they possibly could to try and make money. Some results of this were the 1992 Albert Pyun Captain America film. It's actually 1990, excuse me. 1992 is when they started talking about a director's cut, which actually has been released in pirated copies. In fact, rumor is Albert Pyun himself was selling the director cut versions of that film. Interesting film. I'm sure we will get to it on Cult and Classic Podcast at some point. It's fascinating to look at. Some great practical effects, some great set design, but very strange script. It starred Matt Salinger, who is actually J.D. Salinger's famous author's son, as Captain America. But the reason I mention that is because Albert Pyun has also, of course, worked a lot with Full Moon. And we actually did an Albert Pyun movie when we did
Just Lips.
Vicious Lips. That's right. Which was very oddly put together film. It's also known as Pleasure Planet. I think even Pleasure Dome in some regions. But anyway, back to the point. That was one of the things Marvel had done. Marvel had also been licensing out Spider-Man. The most interesting fact is that Canon, famous for schlocky action pictures, they did some interesting Charles Bronson movies. They did a lot of really fascinating movies. Actually, that I love, lots of cult fandom in there, but they got the property. I don't know how you would not know this, but they didn't understand what Spider-Man even was. So they actually thought it was a horror series, and they got they hired a well-known horror writer to write a series where Peter Parker became a giant tarantula, and they were trying to get Tobe Hooper, fantastic director of course, Texas Chainsaw Massacre fame and many others, to direct. Stan Lee said no and refused that and said, we're not going to, although they were licensed out, so they probably could have done certain things, but they were like, well, we're not going to do that then. So what they did is James Cameron eventually picked up the license with one production house, and James Cameron wanted to do like a hard R Spider-Man, where he was doing a parallel story between the changing into a Spider-Man with puberty, which is interesting because, of course, the incredible Spider-Man 2 with Tobey Maguire, Kirsten Dunst, Sam Raimi at the helm, did not with puberty. They touched on that in the first film, but then they kind of took it to a higher level and did it with erectile dysfunction, with his webs running out, things like that. They worked with these mature themes in the Sam Raimi trilogy, and to great effect, I think. So it was interesting to see that come up here, but there was like a seduction scene with an R-rated sex scene with MJ in it. It would have been fascinating to see, but they couldn't get it together. Who knows why? I mean, James Cameron, of course, then went on to become very successful. He was just moderately successful at the time. But anyway, that's to show that all of their big properties were out the door. Of course, the 1994 Fantastic Four film by Roger Corman was made, which has still never officially been released, and is a tragic story because the people in the film did not understand that this was literally never intended for release. The only reason they did it was for contractual obligation to keep the property. So basically, Roger Corman and mostly probably his second unit directors and things made the entire film simply to shelve it. And really hurt some poor actors' careers. But you can find that. I'm sure we'll talk about it more on Cult and Classic. Again, this is the show that Marvel was literally pawning everything possible to try and get some money. Well, Full Moon Video got a hold of this, and for whatever reason, they ended up losing it before they could make it happen. But of course, the telltale signs are all there. Number one, it's called Dr. Mordrid instead of Doctor Strange. He has a cape and a medallion with powers, just like Doctor Strange. And what was the tagline for Dr. Mordrid? I think it's Master of the Unknown. It's like, it's just very, very close. Super cool though that Jeffrey Combs, great actor, most famous for playing Herbert West in the Reanimator series by Brian Yuzna, plays Dr. Mordrid in this. I guess we could use Doctor Strange interchangeably. Same character. I mean, really, he's the same character. He protects this world. There's a voice that tells him what to do. It's not an origin story at all. We do not get his origin. He doesn't actually seem to be human. And the reason I say that this is Doctor Strange is it's easier to talk about the things that they changed from the Doctor Strange storyline than it is to talk about what they kept the same, because they kept as much as possible the same. The villain is a big sorcerer called Cabal, which is essentially the villain from the 2016 Doctor Strange film. He was another trained sorcerer, trained the same way that Stephen Strange did, or in this case, Dr. Mordrid did, except went the evil route. So it's just... it's not even a parallel. It's a carbon copy in most cases. There are, though, some really cool, weird full moon touches in this movie. First of which, I want to mention the music. The music is by Charles Band, as many of his films are. And it's got this like great... listeners, if you're familiar with RoboCop, and you know I love RoboCop, RoboCop has this super amazingly like satirical 50s like championship superhero, the good always wins theme track. Like it's so out there and like heroic that it actually becomes a piece of the satire itself that Frank Miller and others were creating with RoboCop. That's the level that they aspire to in the Dr. Mordrid theme in the beginning. Like it's just rousing and orchestral and like bigger than the actual movie itself. And then you get like these interludes of Charles Band's typical music, which is good. It's going to sound like Puppet Master. It's going to sound like all of their later, middle 90s films as well. And that's totally fine. It is a good soundtrack crafter. We get a romance in this one too, forming between Dr. Mordrid and his neighbor in this old apartment building. And his neighbor is played by Yvette Nepar, who I know most specifically for playing Detective Madigan in the RoboCop TV series, bringing it always back to RoboCop. But this is the plot. There is an evil sorcerer who is sort of the antithesis to the protective Dr. Mordrid, and he broke loose from his celestial prison, and he's on Earth. He's actually an alchemist, and he's collecting materials like diamonds to do a spell of some kind or some sort of transmogrification, which will allow his demon children, he calls them, his entities from that celestial prison to the Earth, where he can wage war and destroy mankind on the planet. Don't really know his game plan after that point. Not a clue. Guess it doesn't matter. Dr. Mordrid is, of course, charged. This is his entire purpose, is to defeat this evil when it comes, and now it is coming. Brian Thompson is the villain, and he is super recognizable. We've seen him as a huge bodybuilder. He played Shao Kahn in Mortal Kombat Annihilation. That's the second one from '97. He was the Night Slasher in Cobra with Stallone. He plays a lot of like great villains. He's played some other things as well, but great villains, I think, are some of his best features. And he's still alive. I mean, he was only born in '59, and he's still making movies. He's in the Tragedy of Macbeth coming out this year. So fun to see him. He sort of chews the scenery a bit, but I mean, I think that's to be expected. That's his character. He's a 90s comic book movie villain. He's super muscled, and he has long blonde hair that's pulled back into what looks like a mullet, and he wears sunglasses. I mean, and he has a giant chiseled jaw. Like, this is literally his like shtick, and he knows exactly how to roll with it, and he does it. I guess for me, and I'll start with the failings of this movie, is that it never peaks. There's really no climax. There's some cool effects, there's some cool moments, but the ultimate defeat of Cabal is sort of, I'm like, you look at it and you're like, well, why didn't Dr. Mordrid do that to begin with? It didn't make any sense to me. Like, I didn't know why. And I'm wondering how much of that sort of lack of I'm wondering where this movie was in production and securing of things like sets and set pieces. And some of this footage was from another unfinished Full Moon project. Like, how much was done or in process when they lost the licensing and had to change directions? Let's start with you, Jeff. What were you expecting from Dr. Mordrid, and what's your takeaway now that you've seen it?
I'm starting to get excited for Full Moon Productions. Not because they make great films, but they always find the fun and just the thing. And I think the thing that struck me about this film is the set pieces are actually quite good, which I think is really, I honestly, I think that's one of the biggest advantages of the Full Moon. I think they had a really great set department. That apartment, the Dr. Mordrid apartment, is I love it. Like, they got a lot of use out of it.
It's what everybody wants and dreams of when they move to New York, and so far away from anything they will ever attain.
Yeah,
I mean,
I've been scanning Zillow.
books,
Yeah,
corner building, inlaid design on the floor, fireplace, a pet raven named Edgar Allan. Like, these are the things that never gonna happen. Never gonna happen. I thought it was funny that Yvette's character at one point, she plays a character, Samantha Hunt, she finds out he's a landlord, because nobody who lives in the building knows who the landlord is, which is insane. But they don't know, and they're like, and he's like, you're not going to tell anyone, are you? And she's like, that depends. Are you going to fix my garbage disposal? And he goes, consider it done. And I'm like, bitch, first off, that building is from like 1895, number one. Number two, you don't have a garbage disposal, and you certainly it was so out of the element. It was like they were talking about it like it was the apartment from that John Lovitz landlord movie. What was that one called? The Super, was that what it was called? It was that, like, Crowley. I'm like, this is like the most beautiful apartment complex I have ever seen. Like, this is where stars stayed, when they actually became famous and weren't just like the cast off, foreigners of the American East. Yeah, Jeff, sorry, I totally ran over you, but that.
Oh no, but yeah, I mean, I just like this apartment, they had I don't know, some weird scrolls and like lots of books and
a giant
he had this orb in the middle that he summoned his his spirit guide or whatever, and then he had like a portal that he could open in like this gigantic map that like he was like tracking events on. I don't know, there was just so much detail and interesting things going on in this place. It really like came alive, and was like an interesting. It kind of reminded me of like Bad Channels, like that like radio station. They like basically got the entire film in this one set, but they like made a really interesting set that allowed for the film to
and because of where they shot from only a couple of angles in that, I'm assuming it's actually a real location rather than a built set, which I think they're expert at doing because it's cheaper in many cases. But it made me want to know, I'm like, where the hell is this place? Like, does it still exist? Because it really was, it was quite masterful. And I'll just throw on the back of that, the floating like prison, I don't even know what you would call it. It's like a floating section of land in this other dimension, where Cabal and his demons were held. It's not as classy as that, because obviously it is created from something, but it was really interesting to see. Like, the demons are held behind this sort of wall-mounted sewer cover of bronze with the symbol that Dr. Mordrid has on his emblem. We assume he created it. We don't really know the details of that, but and it's guarded by the like grizzled country knight with a grenade launcher that shoots lasers. I wasn't quite sure I got his character, but I didn't really care because his name was Gunnar.
Just fun.
Yeah, he was played by Rich Brinkley. And that's sort of the thing that especially Thor comics in the 80s and 90s did, that, and even before that, like, I loved and I like this in the Thor films of late, despite the fact that they've all been imperfect, is that Thor in the Marvel comics was often after his first few years of creation, he became a sort of science fiction story, where Asgard was an alien world, and there were other alien gods and creatures. Like I'm thinking Beta Ray Bill, who I really want to see in a Marvel film. Like these, like the horse god. Like I want to see these characters. They're really off the wall, and in the comics, they got away with having them because they were amazing. Jack Kirby loved creating these celestial beings, and we loved reading them because it was something new every time. And that's what Full Moon likes to do in these kinds of movies. And I think when they were actually probably released from their contract, or when they lost the licensing for Doctor Strange, it probably freed them up to do something a little wonky like this. Like, well, we don't have this whole centerpiece, so let's make it on this planet that we had for another movie and throw in a weird, like, sass talking, tooth missing, redneck hillbilly knight with a gun. It worked for me. Like you said, it was fun. I didn't care that it was kind of stupid. Yeah, Mandy, let's jump right in here. What was your take on this? What did you expect, and what did you get?
Oh man, so at first I was expecting kind of more of the same from Doctor Strange and Dr. Mordrid, but I was pleasantly surprised that this was a lot of fun. As I mentioned before, the pleat fronted pants, just like the costumes in general, his like shoulder fitted cape, I was obsessed through the whole film.
The cape is awesome. Before we started this section, Tad and Jeff and I were all talking about the cape, because unlike like a Party City cape or something where it's just a rectangle fabric that has a pull string at the top that you tie around your neck and always chokes you, this one had full like shoulder pleat with like a chest strap. So like it actually hung like you see in every comic book. Like this is what, this is what Batman's cape would essentially be. Like it would be some sort of shoulder mounted thing. Like it just makes sense.
Yeah, it was a fitted, like a shoulder fitted garment, like not just a cape. It was a garment.
It was over like a polo shirt, but I mean,
right. Yeah, it was, this hat, I mean, it was like full moon, but like the costuming was really, I felt was really good, but it definitely still had sort of like low budget, maybe made for TV kind of feel to it. Like, oh, this is like clothing that I might buy and wear, like just around the house. Like it's not anything really super high end or like polished for production value or anything. But yeah, so I was pleasantly surprised, like as my expectation. And I thought this one was just really fun. Nothing super thought-provoking, just a good old romp, kind of silly movie with some magic elements to it.
Yeah.
And, an animated dinosaur skeleton, which was just like the cherry on top.
So let's talk about that for a second. So something that Charles Band and Full Moon Features often have ever since before Puppet Master, Laser Blast and things like that, is stop motion animation. And sort of what serves as the climax of this film is Cabal has stolen the Sorcerer's Stone, which is in the Metropolitan Museum of History. Is that what it is? I think. And whatever, the Met History section. And I like that instead of like a rock you can hold in your hand, which is what it's often depicted as, and like I'm thinking of like Full Metal Alchemist and Brother and things like that. It's like a giant brick with a hollow in it, which actually is a really cool idea, because if you're talking about alchemy, you're mixing ingredients and doing essentially chemistry. The fact that the Sorcerer's Stone would actually be a slab that you would be mixing things on that could interact with the materials you're putting in there, that's actually a really cool idea. I thought that was super brilliant.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it's pre-existent, if that actually is what it's referred to in some text. I really don't know, but I thought that was kind of a stroke of genius. But anyway, Cabal gets this piece, which is the last thing he needs to open the gateway to this prison planet and bring his minions over. And Dr. Mordrid can't get there in time, because I think it's hilarious. Not only can he not fly or anything, but he's like, I can't get there in time. Traffic is terrible. I thought it was a hilarious moment. But so he astral projects, and Samantha's character has to watch over his body. And he astral projects to the museum to stop Cabal. Here's what's weird. Is Cabal's like, you can't beat me. You're just an astral form. But But then Dr. Mordred's like, but I can cast spells. And he casts a spell and attacks him. And then he's like, but just one. And then that's it.
Yeah.
Like it knocks him. And then he's like, I'm powerless. And there's two guards come in. Like they're actually police officers, which by the way, the police in this movie are dumb as literal dirt. And that's actually offensive to dirt. They're so incompetent. But I mean, maybe it's realistic. I mean, we've seen a lot of weird shit the last decade here. But so we've got don't put me on a list or anything, okay, NSA.
Too late.
Anyway, of course, I watch full moon movies. I'm already on a lot of lists. But so these guards show up, and Cabal is like, "Oh, you're precious mortals. Like, how you like this?" And he animates the T-Rex skeleton, which instantly eats one of the guards, or masticates him. He doesn't have a stomach. He doesn't eat him, masticates him, and then goes to the other one. And Dr. Mordred looks like heartbroken, but like he can't do anything. And I'm like, oh, I guess he has a limit that he can't do. And then he's like, oh, he gets an idea like a minute 45 into this little exchange and animates the mammoth skeleton next to him to go fight. I don't understand the limitations that were posed that caused this conundrum.
Well, the start didn't even make any sense because he was like, "Oh, well, you can't you're not like in your physical form, so
and
you
then
can't
he
fight me."
blasts him through like a display of alchemy goods.
Yeah, but like, what was he thinking? He was gonna like fist fight him or something? Like, of course he's gonna come and use a spell. Like, obviously,
I mean, it's his entire thing. He's a master of the mystic arts. And by the way, Jeffrey Combs is a phenomenal actor. I really love him. He adds a lot to every role. Even if you're not experienced in cult films, he was an investigator in The Frighteners with Michael J. Fox, Peter Jackson's awesome horror comedy. He was in the awesome full moon feature, the serious feature Castle Freak, the original, where he played. I mean, that was phenomenal, and maybe we'll touch on that at some point in Cult and Classic Podcast. It is such a classic. But anyway, great actor, but he's a small man, and Cabal is not a little person in this movie. He is enormous. And like you said, the idea was going to fist fight him. Like, what in the world? What was the what was the alternative? Like, you had to think of that. You had to. What? I don't understand. The whole end just did not make sense. There was enough going on. I didn't care so much, but I was like, I don't know what's happening. The limitations of their abilities just confused me. Also, so let's go before we get into my bit. Let's go into Tad. Tad, what did you expect when you saw Dr. Mordred, and what did you take from it now that you've seen it?
Okay, so I didn't know that this was a full moon film until like probably 20 minutes before I watched it. And I heard Dr. Mordred, and I'm like, is this going to be some like crappy horror ripoff? And then as soon as I went, oh, never mind, this is full moon, I'm going to love this. And I did. Now, to be fair, this is not on the level of Terror Vision or Bad Channels, which is basically like 1A and 1B in terms of the pure hierarchy of good but full moon films. Nothing's going to beat those two in my eyes unless you can think of something that could possibly be better than those two.
Oh, we've got some on the docket. Trust and believe.
So not only was this pretty damn faithful to the strange mythos, I mean, that apartment looks like Bleecker Street. Like, hardcore looks almost
the
exactly
light
like
coming through his sigil on the thing.
Yes. It literally is, and it makes me think about what could have been if Marvel hadn't been a giant whore in the 90s. And I remember how you said something about the most interesting and worst times of Marvel in the 90s or something. I'm paraphrasing you already.
For some amazing things and some horrible things.
Yes. That's how I describe Rob Liefeld most of the time. Some amazing things and a lot of horrible things.
Little side note on that. I actually lived kind of near him when I lived in Orange County up to a few years ago. And it's funny because we all dog on, if you're a comic fan and you understand Rob Liefeld, he did some really cool work and did some, he's very stylized. He was kind of the face of Image for a while because he was so stylized, but he worked for DC and Marvel and everything. And he became so, like, he was doing so many books at once for Image that he started doing these weird shortcuts and people started calling him on it. Like, his fists were just nubs. Like, real weird. Like, if you Google like the worst Rob Liefeld art, I mean, some of it's pretty insane. The worst one is a Captain America drawing he did for a cover, which is so unbelievably disproportionate. We're not talking like, oh, his muscles are out of control. We're talking his face is on the side of his head, his pec is both on his back and his stomach. Like, it's really out there. And it's easy to pick on it, but when you actually see him do artwork, he is a very skilled artist. And it's very easy to forget that when you do that. I don't know why I got on this sidetrack. You're talking about Rob Liefeld for some horrible things. But anyway, interesting side note. I've seen him do it live. He was doing art at a church for his church function, which I think it was like a mega church. I can't remember, but there's a few of those out there. But it was actually impressive to see him draw these figures. So I was surprised.
Liefeld is responsible for the Pockets meme. He's also responsible for most of what everyone thinks of when they think of 90s X-Men. And he's also responsible for the Tumblr that I used to follow called Rob Liefeld Can't Draw Feet.
Yeah, it's still there. It's still there. And I will say that I think I would say probably most people probably think of Jim Lee for X-Men, but Rob Liefeld was there. And Rob Liefeld, of course, created Youngblood, which was his like, well, I can't do X-Men anymore, but here's our X-Men team for Image. Which was
anyway, my point being is that I can only imagine the heaven I would be in if there was a full moon Marvel extended universe.
So fun.
Oh my God.
So
it would be amazing. I can only imagine what Ghost Rider would have been like if Full Moon had it.
I can imagine. So he would have been a Red Skull, would be my guess. No flames, but a Red Skull. And probably so when you're looking at the Danny Ketch, you know, he has the penance stare, which causes, you know, villain or, you know, evil people to feel all of their sins 100-fold turned against them. It probably just would have become laser beams and exploded faces. I'm totally for it.
There would be slime somehow. And of course, whenever Ghost Rider went to hell or anything involving women, they would be topless and no one would care. Because this is one of those. This is a typical Full Moon film where there's toplessness, but at the same time, it doesn't feel gratuitous. It always feels just kind of that it skirts that line of artistic, and you just are like, hey, there's some tits in this movie, and it doesn't bother you because, well, one, should it bother you, and two, it's done in. Again, it's the same thing. Remember when we had that conversation about Head of the Family, where it's like, how much was that woman topless? And at some point, you just stop thinking about it because she was such a great actress.
Well, at a certain point, like there is a thing where it's like, well, like I'm watching a film right now, which I'll be doing a bonus episode on at some point, which is a recent re-release from Unearthed Films, that nudity is constant, but it is not sexualized. It's actually used as a symbol of vulnerability because we are vulnerable when we're nude. That's why we tend to cover up. That's why every time you see somebody burst into a room and you startle someone and they're in bed, they cover up, right? It's a protection thing. And so when you have someone nude, they are no longer protected. So I think it's interesting that they do have, and I mean, I will say, it was once they lost the license, apparently, is when they turned this into an R-rated film by throwing in a couple of F-bombs and a topless scene. The topless is, of course, Julie Michaels, who is very beautiful, and she was in Point Break, the Keanu Reeves version. She was in Jason Goes to Hell. She was probably, I think most people might think of her as Denise from Roadhouse. So she's an iconic bombshell of the 90s. And I actually was sad that I only have like that she only had a little bit of scene, because it was a good scene. Essentially, she's a sacrifice to it. I didn't even realize why she was killed by Cabal in the beginning, and then I realized it was to mark her with Dr. Mordrid's logo, essentially, to link him to the crime. Presumably, they don't say that, but it seems to be the way that what it was done for. And it's kind of sad because it would have been great to have her just running around topless or otherwise throughout the movie. But yeah, it's like Full Moon. Charles Band and apparently his father Albert, they know how to sell a movie, right? They're like, hey, this is a direct to video. We no longer have the Marvel name on this even, so we're gonna add a little bit of violence. There's not really heavy gore at all. We're gonna have a little bit of violence. We're gonna have what we already were gonna have, which is animatronic skeletons and stuff like, stop motion skeletons, and then we're gonna have Jeffrey Combs, because anytime we can use Jeffrey Combs, we're going to use him. And nudity. And there you go. And I will say that she is nude at the same time that what is the Cabal, who, as I said, is played by Brian Thompson, is heavily topless. Yes, he has pants on, but I mean, you'd be hard pressed to have a better physical appearance than his chest. It's really shocking. Like I don't know what 36 pack he's got under his skin, but it was crazy. So yeah, I agree. It was fun, and I would have loved to see this be an official Doctor Strange film. I think that it's kind of crazy that more people don't know it. Like it's actually a little crazy that they didn't get in trouble for it because of how extremely close it is to Doctor Strange. And I imagine that Marvel's predicament at the time was the reason. I think
probably just wrote it off.
I think that it saved them, because it's a shame to me that Doctor Strange fans don't know about this movie, because this would have been the Doctor Strange movie.
I imagine they would have gotten some bad press. Like, you know, I don't know the details of how the license was taken back or what it was, but like it would probably feel a little vindictive and not gone over well in the public if they attacked Full Moon for...
Well, and that could be why, because they were already facing such negative press by the really oppressive atmosphere of the creators that eventually left and formed Image. So it's like, I think you're right. I think that there was a storm. I think one, it's probably likely that they had so much on their plate already that they didn't care. They're like, look, we already got some money from licensing that you've lost, and we're going to take it back, and I don't give a shit what you do. And then it's, you know, you can't use our name. We're going to move on with our life and file for bankruptcy in a couple of years. And Full Moon was like, well, Full Moon's not going to waste anything. Like, they've got many movies that have never been fully produced, yet have been used in other movies of theirs. You know what I mean? They're masters of reuse, reduce, recycle. Yeah. And I think that this is kind of a success. I think that the stop motion animation on the skeletons is some of their best, if not their best. I actually thought it was
pretty
excellent.
Good,
yeah. The green screening, if any, was used on that portion of the film I couldn't tell. I mean, it looked like they used large scale figures. I'm sure they didn't, but that's what it looked like. So good on them. When the T-Rex eats a person, yeah, I can tell he's. But they were smart. They didn't green screen him. They stop motion animated him. So both the man being eaten and the figure were stop motion animated. And they're always good with their little zombie like skeleton beast creature effects. So when when his Cabal's minions are climbing out of the manhole on another realm, it looked good. I want to give a shout out in particular to the detailed, when the big bronze or brass manhole-ish cover that's holding back the demons, when it starts to give way and they pound on it from the other side and the dings come through, that was, I still don't actually know how they did that, because it was a master cut. Like, it was a masterful cutting and effect. I'm not exactly sure what they did to make that effect, because it was quite beautiful, quite just such a small moment, but so well done that I took a moment to reflect how well they did that. I imagined that it was 3 different versions of the lid, one with 1 ding, one with 2 dings, one with 3 dings, one with no dings, and they did like just a stop and a cut. And because they had a stationary camera and a stationary, set piece, they just swapped it out in miniature. I assume that's the case. Don't know. Some other things that people who look real close will notice is that, like, when Strange visits the prison planet the first time and finds out officially that that Rich's character, Rich Brinkley's character, has been attacked and Cabal has escaped. His character has like no eyes. It's clearly that they're appliques of some kind over his eyes, but they're kind of gruesome, right? It looks like they've been stitched shut, but they're like wide open. And he's like, he took my sight, and Dr. Mordrid heals him, and it's a nice, cute moment. But it's just that kind of practical effects. Even when they're obviously cheap effects, you can make them satisfying to look at. It's artwork, even if it's goofy, it's artwork and it adds interest.
It also doesn't matter as much when the character interactions are so good, because everyone in this movie does a great job of acting. The banter is fantastic. It feels natural. It doesn't.
The script is actually pretty good. Like I think Samantha Hunt, the character Samantha Hunt that Yvette plays, is like, she has some good lines. There's the whole interaction in the beginning when you first see Dr. Mordrid in his room, and this man, this actor with his big dog, and the old woman who lives across the hall, who's like the complainer and the snoop. They're arguing about the dog, and they knock on Samantha's door because she works at the police department, even though she's not an officer, she's a researcher, and like try and get her to take one side or the other. Like that dialogue and that interaction, they use character actors who are established in playing bit parts across TV and otherwise. They know what they're doing. They play a character well, and they take it, and it elevates the entire scene above a normal low budget feature. And it's like, just picking those small roles right really, really helps. And that's something that I think a lot of short films, low budget films, don't do. Of course, no budget films often use friends. We've certainly done that. I'm no great actor yet. I've appeared in all of my insanely bad short films and a couple of good ones. But it makes a difference, and it makes the products look, even for Full Moon, I feel like certain things are better than others. And we just lost we just lost Mandy because her basement is flooding. That is why I live in Palm Springs. If the basement is flooding, it's the end of the world. Yeah. So thank you, Mandy, for being a part of this. I've talked a bunch on this. We can move on to recommendations here. I will say one thing before we do, though. My biggest complaint with this movie was not that the climax is a little like one note, because the effects are great and I enjoyed it one way or the other. It's that Dr. Mordrid, much like Doctor Strange in the 78 movie that we discussed, he actually doesn't do much. He really doesn't do much. Like in the comics, Doctor Strange is solving problems and he's using spells. And in these, probably because of budget limitations, but also I think just a lack of really trying to think of creative ways for him to do things, he doesn't do things. I mean, Doctor Strange should not be hampered by not being able to get across town fast enough. You know, that is not something that this character should have a problem with. I thought it was hilarious that he did, but it's a weak moment. But still, it's Full Moon. It's kind of Full Moon in sort of their heyday as well. You know, now a lot of times for budget reasons, but you'll get away with like holding a puppet or a miniature instead of stop motion animating something. And watching the craftsmanship in this one, it really does add so much, and it's appreciated by the viewer. So Tad, who would you recommend Dr. Mordrid to, and why?
Well, the obvious recommendation is anyone who enjoys Full Moon, but I would recommend this overall. This is another hidden gem of which I had never known as a comic book fan. I didn't realize. I knew there was an old Doctor Strange film, and now I am disappointed to know that I've watched it. This one surprised me because it was definitely better than the Captain America films that I had watched when I was a kid. It was definitely better than the Spider-Man ones. It's sort of on that level. The Incredible Hulk, when you go back and watch it now, it definitely shows its age, but it kind of has that feeling that Quantum Leap does.
You're talking about the TV series.
Yes.
Yeah.
Quantum Leap was fascinating in its character study in the same way that Star Trek was, but you can tell like the production value and all that, it doesn't necessarily hold up, but the themes do. And I can say that for a lot of Full Moon productions, that the themes hold up, the acting holds up, everything feels schlocky and definitely feels like a period of its time, but these are definitely worth watching. This one I enjoyed, and I actually was surprised how short it was. I actually was like, this was the perfect length for me to watch. And then I went, it could have gone longer and I still would have been pretty happy. Actually, an extra 5-10 minutes, they might have been able to get a more satisfying ending through it. But
yeah, so there was actually a sequel planned, and unfortunately it didn't come to fruition, which is a bummer because I'd really like that. And I think that an extra 10 minutes giving us like that glimpse of the ultimate baddie, you know, that moment when we see Thanos for the first time and then the movie ends, or the moment when we see the nameless one, like that could have added that bigger, like, oh, what's this next part? Because in this, we don't really get that so much. We don't know possibly what the next bit could be. And I would have loved to see that, even if we never did get a sequel. And I really wish we'd gotten a sequel. But I don't know. I don't know if they downplayed this release because, which also could be why they tapered off the ending the way they did, because they were concerned about copyright issues. That's very possible. But yeah, I it's the kind of movie that if you saw a Sci-Fi Channel at 9 in the morning on a Saturday and you weren't doing anything and no one was home, you'd leave it on and you'd be like, this was cool. I like this. This was fun. It's like reading a junk comic book from the 80s, right? Like, it's like, oh, that was cool. Like, they'll probably never continue that story. And I don't know that I'll really think about it that often, but I enjoyed the time I spent with it. Jeff, would you recommend Dr. Mordrid? And if so, why?
Yeah, it hits the entertainment buttons for me. I'm trying to think of who else it would do that for. I think that if you're really snobby about movies, you're probably not going to like this. But if you're just in it for a good time and you can actually enter the film, and I'm worried that I'm starting to like full moon films. I'm going to start getting the expectations up here. No. But I think going in it with just being like, this is going to be silly and it's going to be fun and you can enjoy it. So I think anybody who can go into a film like that, without expecting the moon is going to have a good time.
I think that's solid.
Yeah.
The moon. And I think the full moon. And I think too, it's one of those weird movies where if you watched it with like your 8-year-old kid, yes, there's a scene where a woman is nude. You just see her top, but a woman is nude, but it's not graphically gory. It's not, there's no actual like simulated sex. It's sort of like one of those things where we all as kids watching movies and TV with our parents, whatever, would be like, oh, this person is naked in this scene. And then it goes past it. And you're like, okay, well, that was kind of naughty, but let's move on. And then you can watch this with them. It's one of those films where, yes, there's a little bit of nudity and there's some people that die. It is in no way shocking or gratuitous or
there is like the impaling with the tusk it's a little gory.
Yeah, so Cabal is impaled, okay. But it's very much a goofy, there's blood on the tusk, but it's very goofy. And I agree, that is the only part. And we appreciate that, right? Because finally I get, the bad guy actually got shanked. Even his henchman who is trying to kill Dr. Mordrid's inert body is not really, there's a little bit of blood when he gets shot in the leg, but he's not even killed, right? The police actually take him in, which, as my wife walked in during the scene, said, well, that's why we know this isn't a realistic movie, as they took him in alive, to which I pointed out, well, he is white. That's the world we live in. But anyway, I'll get to my recommendation. Yeah, I recommend Dr. Mordrid. I think in the grand scheme of full moon videos, from the most epic of crazy fun to the most cheap of churned out, of which there are also many, I think Mordrid is right in the middle. I think it's maybe a little upper middle. It's during their peak, so there's, as Jeff said, great set pieces. As Tad said, if you are a comic book fan in general and you like the kind of comic book movies that came out of the 90s where they simplified or changed backstory, but we were just so glad to see comic action on screen and our favorite characters that we ate it up anyway, you'll enjoy this. If you're a Doctor Strange fan, you actually should see this because it's fun to see the unknown Doctor Strange movie, because it's not just that it was a takeoff of Doctor Strange, it was a Doctor Strange film that had to be slightly modified for legal purposes. And I think people don't really know much about that. But I would say for a person who's looking for a movie to really satisfy them, I only watch one movie a month, and I need something that I'm going to think about a lot. Well, no, this isn't for you. This is a lazy Sunday afternoon film, and that's what it's meant to be. And that's one of the things Full Moon is so great at, is they aim at what you want. They aim at the movie being entertaining, solidly made, and having some fun, you know, I don't like the word, but nuggets of goodness like animation or special effects or practical effects or really good performances or surprise acting moments here and there in there. So it elevates it above, you know, CGI shark garbage, although there's a place for that. We here at Colton Classic respect it. It elevates it far above that, and they're not trying to shoot, you know, for Tenet, which, by the way, the fuck. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say on that. I appreciate you guys being here. I appreciate you listeners. To play us out, as always, is the Chud with All About Evil. And I want to wish Mandy, hope that her basement is not super flooded and that she didn't have any cool stuff down there like movies or comic books. And guys, write in. We love hearing from you. Instagram at Colton Classic Podcast, Gmail at coltonclassicpodcast@gmail.com. Go to our website, coltonclassicpodcast.com. We also have zines for sale, all sorts of cool stuff. Have a great day. Hey everyone, thanks for listening to Colton Classic Podcast. This podcast is important to me, but what's more important are the rights, privileges, and freedom from violence of everyone in this country and in this world. And that means supporting Black Lives Matter. If you'd like to make a donation, please go ahead and visit coltonclassicpodcast.com, where we have a list of places you can donate and help out. And please stay safe.